Okay, well, in the interest of time, it is now 5 o'clock, and we potentially have an endless series of things we can talk about related to the world of fragmentology. So, quick introduction, I'm Eric Johnson. I'm your moderator for this session. I'm the curator for Thompson Special Collections at The Ohio State University. That's kind of an overarching title when it comes to the scope of the subject areas for which I'm officially responsible for. I'm the resident pre-modernist with an academic background in medieval studies. And my own area of expertise is in manuscript studies broadly defined, but then more specifically in the world of fragments and fragmentology. Before we really get started today with the stars of our show, I'll have some opening remarks, a couple pieces of logistics. We're going to proceed with your chat ability off until about 6:10. That's the current schedule. At around 6:10, we'll open up the chat and people can start submitting questions. And the speakers themselves, the panelists themselves, are going to be introducing themselves, and I'll explain that a little bit more in a second. But I'd like to thank you all for attending. This is clearly a popular topic. I've been blown away by the response. We're technically oversubscribed apparently by about 139 people. So that is really, really, really good for the world of fragmentology. I'm glad to see there's that much interest in it. I'd also like to extend a profound thanks to Laura Adam, Laura Perrings, and Neil Curtis, and all the people at Rare Book School for facilitating this, for bringing it all together, for providing us with a platform to undertake this program today. We couldn't have done it without them, and it's fantastic. So the motivation for this session, when I first thought about doing this, it originally stemmed from my own interest in work with Western European medieval manuscript fragments. But the problem of manuscript fragments and the topic of fragmentation in general is not just related to a period between, say, roughly 500 and 1500 CE in the Western European world. It's actually a problem, a set of challenges, a set of opportunities. Fragmentology that is international in scope. It's cross-cultural in scope. It's pan-temporal in scope. It doesn't stop in the Renaissance. It continues up until today. And it's interdisciplinary or even transdisciplinary in scope. So if you want a really quick example of how open this topic actually is, just go to eBay and put in any sort of keyword combination that's related to manuscript fragments. Manuscript fragment itself, manuscript leaf, manuscript folio. I did that about 20 minutes before getting on the Zoom meeting, and it came up with well over 600 different hits combined between these various keyword searches. And it wasn't just Latin or Western European manuscripts. Things that popped up included manuscripts produced in Western Europe, not just in Latin, but in a whole handful of vernacular languages, manuscripts from Eastern Europe, from the Pacific Islands, from India, from North Africa, from all over the Near East, in the Hebrew tradition, the Arabic tradition, the Coptic tradition, the Korean, Chinese, Sanskrit, it's everywhere. Also, in terms of what a fragment is, we saw in this search loose quires, individual leaves, cuttings, individual lines. This isn't something that I saw today, but I use this with scare quotes. One of the favorite instances of manuscript fragmentation that I've seen on the eBay venue was actually, I believe it was last summer, I came across a dealer or an individual, I'm not sure if he was a professional dealer or not, but he was selling manuscripts of Abraham Lincoln's letters, supposedly. And he had acquired a clutch of these and took a picture of each individual letter and then cut out individual words and sold individual words from each letter on eBay. And what you got if you won the auction was that little piece of paper. It could be a definite article or it could be a long compound word. And you would get that single little cutting on a piece of paper along with a high quality reproduction of the entire letter for authentication purposes, that you had something really from an Abe Lincoln letter. The forms and formats in which fragments travel are as varied as the manuscripts from which they come. And in this session today, we want to kind of cover a whole lot of these different kind of worlds of fragments. The effects of manuscript fragmentation will also be considered here, and the impact that fragmentation has had on the worlds of academia, cultural heritage more widely, collecting, both private and institutional, and what kind of the act of collecting means in terms of fragmentation and its perpetuation or its cessation possibly, and also the world of commerce. Fragmentation has impacted all of these worlds, and we're going to aim to address some of the challenges and opportunities that are posed by fragments as objects and tools, as well as the very kind of act, the concept and the act of fragmentation. So I wanted to talk a little bit about demographics of fragment interaction for a minute. So when you all registered for this session, you were asked to answer 3 questions. I wasn't sure when we set this up what kind of response we would get. We had 438 full responses to this question. I spend a lot of my professional life in an editorial role reviewing a lot of statistically driven survey articles, and never do I typically see anything above a 50 to 55% response rate. We're at nearly 100% response rate for this, so thank you to everyone for being candid in your answers. But this was an unscientific survey. But what we asked for, question 1 was, do you personally own any fragments? Out of the 438 responses, 18.3% of you indicated that you do own at least one fragment. 81.7% no. So we have nearly a 20% ownership rate in the 438 responses. The second question was, have you considered the ethical issues, pro or con, of fragment collecting and book breaking in general? I was gratified to see that 90.6% of the respondents indicated that yes, you have considered this. 9.4% hadn't. I would like to maybe redo this survey at some point with more nuance to kind of tease out some of that meaning. And then the demographics of the audience. There are all sorts of different approaches that one can take to fragmentation and fragments in general. And what we will see when the panelists introduce themselves are a whole variety of these perspectives in play. But the options that we gave people to respond to were teacher. 20.3% of you indicated that you were teachers. 55.5% of you indicated that you come from the librarian ranks. 34.7% indicated that you're a researcher. 2.7% indicated that you're coming from the dealing, auction, or commerce world. 19.4% of you indicate that you're students. 6.8% of you identified as private collectors, and 14.2% were other, whatever that means, another area I'd like to nuance. If you're keeping up with that math, this is well over 100%. And what that indicates is that there are all sorts of different hats that a single person can wear simultaneously when it comes to fragments and fragmentation. And just in the interest of full disclosure, I wear multiple hats myself. I'm a teacher, I'm a researcher, I'm a librarian and a curator responsible for building a manuscripts collection. I own some manuscript fragments myself that I regularly employ in my own teaching and my own research. And on top of that, I consider myself a perpetual student when it comes to manuscript studies. I may be teaching students one day, but I'm listening to Lisa Fagin Davis the next and learning from her. So I've got 5 hats that I'm wearing right there. So we're going to see a similar blurring of roles when the panelists introduce themselves. But before I kick it over to them, I wanted to acknowledge that this world of fragments and fragmentation is incredibly fraught and contentious. There are very, very strong opinions that all of us have, and with good reasons. We can all decry criminal acts of book breaking or book destruction. Nazi book burnings come to mind. Most of us on this call will probably have heard of Otto Egge and his destruction of countless manuscripts, supposedly, and with some degree of truth to support his educational concerns. But let's be fair, he made a profit off of this too. We can all have our opinions on this, but what I would like to use as a guide today is for our conversation, both as the panelists, but then also when we open it up to the wider audience, is to be kind and to be open-minded in the way we consider fragmentation. Earlier today, my co-instructor, Leslie Lockett, a professor in the English department here at OSU, she and I were leading our co-taught manuscript studies course. And not coincidentally, today's topic was fragmentology. And we talked about a handful of articles in the field and opened it up for a wide discussion. And the best summary of how I want us to all approach this topic today was really put into words by one of the students. And what she said was, when asked about how we should think about the act of fragmentation and how we should think about those people who have broken manuscripts, whether it's in the past or today. And what she said was, passing judgment is so much less interesting than trying to understand the perspective behind any act of fragmentation. I can't agree with that more. Despite my own personal feelings about individual acts of book destruction, what I'd like us all to focus on is the perspectives behind that and what we can learn from those perspectives. So let's let that be a guide. So without further ado, I'm going to kick this over to the panelists themselves. They're each going to introduce themselves, let us know a little bit about who they are and where they come from and why they are interested in the world of either fragments as small bits of manuscripts or the act of fragmentation, inclusive of libraries being destroyed and books being removed from their original historical context. So without further ado, Lisa, take it away.
Thank you, and thank you so much, everyone who's attending. Oh my gosh, and I see so many familiar faces. Hi, everyone. Eric, that was a fantastic summary, I think, of the issues at play here, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate you, your kind words about me. I learn from you all the time, and I appreciate the work that you're doing at Ohio State. So I am, in my day job, the executive director of the Medieval Academy of America. If you are not a member, I invite you to go to medievalacademy.org and see what we're up to. But I am also a paleographer, a codicologist, a manuscript bibliographer, a blogger, and a fragmentologist. And I have been studying medieval manuscript fragments, Western European for the most part, since that's my area of expertise, for 30 years now, beginning as a graduate student at Yale, where I was cataloging liturgical fragments and also writing about a collection of fragments for my dissertation. I have since, in other parts of my scholarship, developed a real interest in the corpus of medieval manuscripts in the United States and Canada. And as part of that, really became interested in particular in fragments, in the corpus of manuscript fragments in North America. And as Eric mentioned, a lot of that has to do with Otto Ege and his ilk and the trade in whole leaves from books that had been intentionally cut up and intentionally scattered. And so that's really the focus of my work now. And that includes my work as a fragmentologist. I use fragments for teaching, I use leaves for teaching, and I'm really interested in the digital modes of scholarship for manuscript fragments, in particular the digital reconstruction of fragmented books like the one in my background, the Beauvais Missal, but I also use that methodology in my classroom at the Simmons School of Library and Information Science, where my students do a digital reconstruction every year of a manuscript dismembered by Otto Ege. So we're trying to find ways to bring the study of manuscript fragments into the classroom, not just using actual fragments when possible, if you happen to be somewhere that has a fragment collection, but also in the digital realm.
Excellent. Tom, do you want to kick it off next?
I'll try to kick it off, Eric. I'm Tom Bredehoft. I would say that I'm a former academic, currently a collector of some fragments and a dealer in the same, although I sell other books and so on as well. I started being interested in fragments because I was interested in binding fragments, in particular old pieces of manuscripts that had been recycled in bindings. And I started buying them thinking explicitly that these are not cut leaves, that there were ethical and other problems that I might be anxious about in relationship to leaves cut in modernity. And I started buying and collecting binding fragments as a result. But as time has gone on, one picks up the occasional cut leaf. One of the stories I often tell is that the the least expensive manuscript leaves I ever bought. I paid $9.99 for two, and they were being sold by a person who breaks things up, and I had a chance to buy these and one more leaf from the same book in a separate lot, and I got to keep them together. And I think that's one of the things that is really, really fascinating about the marketing leaves, and the marketing cut leaves in particular, is that there is this tension between sellers who have a tendency to break things up. And I should say explicitly, I'm very careful not to break things up that I come across or get a hold of, and try to sell them on in wholeness. Although I suppose I can't always control what people who buy from me do with things. But I'm fascinated by the tension between sellers who break things up because there's a monetary reason to do so. But the role of the collector can be the opposite. The role of the collector can make the effort to keep things together that ought to be together. And I think collecting is, in a very real sense, the opposite of fragmentation. And I guess that's going to be my starting position and starting comment.
Great, thanks, Tom. Sumayya?
Hi, everyone. My name is Sumayya Ahmed. I'm an assistant professor in the archives department at Simmons University, School of Library and Information Science. So why I come to this discussion is I've conducted research on modern manuscript culture in Morocco, North Africa, where there still exist these extensive stores of historical manuscripts in Arabic, in Amazigh, Berber languages, even in Judeo-Arabic, but that are kept in private homes. So one of the oft quotes that I like to share is that, some manuscript scholars in Morocco say that what is in private homes is actually more than what you'll see in any kind of repositories. Meaning if you were to, count everything that's publicly available in Moroccan archives and libraries, which is extensive, that what is still being kept by private families is more than that. So my research actually pays attention to the tension between institutional communities' priorities with respect to preservation of manuscripts and the lived experiences of these private families who consider themselves as safeguards, stewards of manuscript culture. So while there are many types of fragmentation, obviously the physical destruction of codices, there's also this conceptual idea of fragmentation. And I come to today's discussion primarily from the point of view of fragmentation of collections and the perception of the fragmentation of collections. And that's based on my discussion of these issues with these private owners, these private collectors in Morocco, who for them, fragmentation starts with colonialism, right? It starts when you have European powers coming who are manuscript hungry, right? It starts with, if anyone takes a good look at, the French National Library's manuscripts collections, very healthy selection from North Africa. So for them, fragmentation is not just about the physical codices, but this kind of, I would say, I don't want to say imagine, but this conceptual idea of a national corpus of manuscripts, or even something that's even supranational, something that belongs to, say, the Muslim community, or maybe it belongs to the specific communities that they feel that they are part of, and that they see that something has been is being fragmented in that way, and also on levels of family collections that they feel. So this comes, for me, it's tied into ideas of societal provenance, which is archival scholars talk about this as the fact that records are the products of a variety of factors, that they come from communities who not only produce records, but also give context to records. And so if we're fragmenting at whatever level, we're somehow disconnecting these manuscripts from their communities. So I'd be happy to talk about any of this in more detail later, and just thank you for having me here.
Thanks. Jim, you're up.
Hi, my name is Jim Sims. I'm a private collector. I bought my first rare book at the age of 12. Didn't cost much, and it wasn't that rare, but it was a start. But all things have a beginning. I've always been kind of a nerdy, bookish kid, even though now I'm a 54-year-old kid. And yeah, so I started collecting manuscripts more seriously about 22, 23 years ago. when I encountered the very last remnants of the folio files collection in this file incarnation in Santa Fe. Since then, I've collected from basically every manuscript dealer in the United States, auction houses across Europe, and my passion is the history of writing. I'm interested in script. Decoration is beautiful, but it's not always very affordable, and that's not exactly what I go for. And I understand there are issues with provenance. It's a thing that you become more aware of with time. You know, it's why some people cease to eat meat and become vegan. Some people like to hunt. I do, but I hunt for fossils because I figure they're already extinct, so I'm not doing a whole lot of damage to any sort of species out there. And I approach my manuscript collecting in the same way. I'm hunting for fossils. I'm not trying to shoot and bag and mount anything living, you know. So what's really attracted to me about fragments is seeing that these things have been a book cover or a scrap of a binding or something like that. And it's fun. That said, I've also tried very hard not to be a manuscript hoarder and to share my collection in as many ways as possible. And so I brought them to seminars, and they're being used in exhibits and situations such as that. I think that's a good opening right there, so I'll stop. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jim. And Rose.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending tonight. My name is Rose McCandless, and I am a fourth year at Ohio State University studying medieval and Renaissance studies and history. I fall into the role of both a student and a researcher in the world of fragmentology. And I also kind of have diverse interests across manuscript studies. I have been doing work for the National Museum of Scotland and doing some manuscript related things for them, as well as working for an established rare book firm, cataloging manuscript fragments for them. I originally became interested in fragmentology and the many questions involved with its study when I took the manuscript studies course that Eric mentioned that he is currently teaching 2 semesters or 2 years ago. And for this course, I undertook research on a 73-leaf 13th century Paris Bible fragment located at the Pontifical College Josephinum here in Columbus. This manuscript was fragmented between 1996 and 1998 and really introduced me to the various dilemmas involved with collecting, studying, and especially creating modern fragments. Since then, I've begun researching biblioclasm within the context of emotional theory, particularly what the openly professed and covertly expressed emotions of biblioclasts demonstrate about how they think about books and fragmentation, and in many ways how they justify it both to themselves and others. I'm also extremely interested in the dichotomy between egalitarianism and capitalism in the study of cut leaves, as well as the many issues of access that are so heavily tied up in this field as a whole. My position as a student is somewhat fraught within my own study, since, as we know, and as is the reason that we're all here today, fragmentation is a very complex and often unsavory practice. Yet my own research and career have been made possible by the study of fragments. So I'm excited to explore all of these things today.
All right, thanks everyone. Gosh, you all have introduced so many different perspectives, so many different ways we could potentially go. And most of you, if not all of you, have already kind of started to hit on this idea, but I figured what better way to kind of launch a broader discussion than to ask you all to elaborate a little bit about what it is we might mean when we say manuscript fragment. Is there an easy definition for this? Is there an easy definition in understanding what that means, not just in terms of like an actual definition for it, but what we mean in terms of the implications of that term? And one of the things that I think about, and we talked a little bit about this earlier in my class today, is that when we're speaking about the field of manuscript studies, and in my context specifically medieval manuscript studies, even if we're talking about an intact codex, we're talking from a field of fragmentation. I don't have the footnote to hand for you, but numerous different scholars over the past 40, 50 years have kind of thrown away as a truism that we only have roughly maybe 5% or examples of about 5% of all the medieval manuscripts that were ever written between 500 and 1500 CE. And that is in any form, whether a complete codex or represented by a single cutting. So we're by necessity working out of a field of fragmentation, even when we're thinking about complete documents. So what do you guys think fragment means? And what do you think are some of the latent challenges and opportunities with that term? Go ahead, Lisa.
Yes, so first of all, I wanted to just give a shout out to Jim, who I can confirm is a really generous collector and makes his collection available for study. I'm really grateful to you for that. He owns one of the Beauvais Missal leaves and has always been very generous in sharing, and I appreciate that. And I think Sumayya has really hit on a really important point, and especially in North America, where if you're talking about manuscripts that originated overseas, every single one of them is by definition part of a fragmented collection. We don't have coherent, very few, there are a few, but it's very rare in the United States to actually have an intact collection. So when you talk about fragmentation in the context of North America, you really are talking about fragmentation in terms of collections, in terms of books, in terms of single leaves, and in terms of pieces of leaves, right? So it's almost, you sort of get down to a more and more molecular level as these things get divided and scattered. And the real question is, can we somehow correct that? We can't correct it physically. It's impossible to imagine bringing all the molecules back together, but we can start thinking digitally in terms of digitally putting collections back together. That's something that's happening. And of course, digitally putting manuscripts back together. So I think there are a lot of different ways you can think about fragmentation, but I think it is almost kind of an ontology, a descending hierarchy from a larger, the larger collection down through the single book to the single leaf to the part of a leaf, and apparently to the single word on the leaf. And I have to say, Eric, when you told that story about the Lincoln letters, I had not heard that. My jaw fell open. That's absolutely stunning. And I hope to God that that's not an actual letter. I hope that maybe it was not authentic in the end. I hope, because that was really that was pretty shocking.
Anyone else want to take a stab at defining what you think fragment or fragmentation means?
I mean, I think a really important thing to consider when thinking about what is a fragment is asking ourselves the question, when is a medieval or later manuscript really ever complete? It's very unusual that manuscripts enter the modern age with their original binding, all of their leaves, all of their illuminations, etc. And I think that's an issue that's heavily tied into fragmentation because it is so common for biblioclasts to use previous fragmentation to justify their own biblioclasm. For example, the Bible that I study was purchased at auction as a codex, but already missing 22 leaves and multiple illuminations. So when it was purchased, it was essentially considered already broken, and therefore there was, to the breaker, no kind of moral obligation to keep it in its prior state. And even breaking down this specific Bible further, it has been fragmented, but the largest recorded fragment that exists still together is 73 leaves. So to what extent is that a fragment? And I think all of these are questions that are tied up just in the definition.
I would define, of course, anything that's not the complete text is a fragment. But in my own personal vernacular, A complete leaf is a complete leaf. A fragment, to me, is a portion of a leaf where even the single unit of a page is no longer in its entirety. So that's how I see a fragment personally, though I understand that the other definitions are valid.
No, I agree with you there, Jim. I think in terms of clarifying terminology, for my own work, I would talk about a cutting versus a fragment versus a leaf.
I agree.
That I would use those three terms. I wouldn't use the word fragment to describe a leaf of the Beauvais missal. It may be a fragment of the book because the book is in fact fragmentary, but in terms of actual kind of librarian-esque definitions, I would also use, make a distinction there between cutting, fragment and leaf. I think that's important too, because it has to do with the origins and the motivation of the fragmentator, right? So when you're talking about cuttings of initials, those are usually from, you know, the 17th, 18th, 19th century. In those albums, people are cutting out letters and making little, you know, like ransom notes out of them, as opposed to binding fragments, which are medieval recycling from centuries ago, as opposed to single leaves and the leaf trade, when we are talking about a much more capitalist motivation. Even if, you know, so Eggy always said, or Duchnez, or whoever you want to talk about, would always make the excuse that, well, it was already missing the calendar, so it was already imperfect. So why, there's nothing wrong with cutting it up. And if, you know, that's, I don't accept that as a justification. But you also then have this question of the pedagogical piece, where again, Eggy always said that he was cutting them up to use them for teaching. And that is in fact what ended up happening, is that you have now all over the United States and Canada, all of these, you know, and here I'm just talking about Eggy, but you have all of these portfolio boxes and Eggy leaves and Eggy collections in collections that don't have or can't afford complete codices. All they have are leaves, and those they can now use, for teaching. And that's, you know, we're getting onto the ethical side of things, and that's, you know, it's not a justification, but it is a beneficial outcome, I would say, of a harmful practice.
I just wanted to throw out there, I don't have the link to hand, but if memory serves, Peter Kidd's fantastic Manuscripts Provenance blog, and something that he put up maybe within the last 18 months, he tries to tackle the nomenclature of fragments. So Lisa, when you were talking about cutting and clipping, you know, all of these things, if I recall correctly, Peter talks about that and gets towards that. And that is something that I think the field could really benefit from, is getting some sort of standardized nomenclature for this.
A little more precision there, yeah.
Yeah, I despair of it happening, considering, you know, paleographical terminology still isn't set after, you know, 200-300 years. So
right, let's talk about terminology of Gothic script and see how we do.
When we think about these fragments and trying to define them, another thing that I talked about with my class today was my own attempts to define these things. Is I tried to divide things into broad families, and the two broadest families are licit and illicit fragments in my own head. And this is a shifting line in the sand that we all have to draw for ourselves as to what we mean by licit and illicit. For me, a licit fragment would be, say, something that is the product of deep historical breaking. So I don't for a minute think that Henry VIII had altruistic motivations in licensing the destruction of manuscripts during the dissolution of the monasteries, but these things happen so far back, there's nothing we can do about it now. So, and we're not going to directly support through purchase any of the people who broke these manuscripts. An illicit fragment would be something that was purchased at auction 2 days ago, cut apart yesterday, and sold today. And those are kind of my broad definitions. Where the problem comes in is in the dating of fragments and their licitness or illicitness. I've heard some people say, oh, you know, I consider anything a bad fragment if it was broken within the last 50 years, 75 years, 100 years, 10 years. This is that shifting line in the sand. what are your perspectives on what makes a licensed illicit fragment versus an illicit fragment? And I'd love to hear this from especially the collector and dealer points of view.
Can I join in at this point?
Yes, please.
Because I mean, it's really interesting, some of the issues you bring. As I've said earlier, obviously I come from the context of North Africa, studying manuscript culture in North Africa. So, you know, the idea that the later the breaking happened, you know, the less guilty we feel doesn't quite go over for our, you know, because we're still dealing with like this idea of some kind of restoration of things that have been taken. I mean, and I know the term decolonization is I think it's fading now, but it was very popular maybe a couple of months ago. But we're still at a time period where people, colonized peoples, are still looking for restoration of their materials, whether or not that's North Africa, West Africa, South Asia. And so the going back, however far you want to go back, doesn't make it licit for us or for those people at any point. So that for us, for people who are concerned with restitution, the time period does not make it licit. And even, you know, if it's the situation in which things were bought. I mean, some things were bought legally, but the situation, the cultural domination, the economic situation with which people are forced to sell sometimes. For me, what makes, you know, if you're saying what defines a fragment, I don't want to break the chain between the community that created those manuscripts and the fragment or the manuscript codex. And so for me, it's always however I'm defining that fragment, I want to keep the community that created that from which it came from in mind. And I think sometimes when we're dealing with fragments and fragmentation, it's a good way to, because it's such a small piece of things, that we can absolve ourselves of how we came to own it. And it's actually funny because I didn't think about it until just now that I actually have fragments myself. When people say they have fragments, I was thinking, do I have fragments? Yes, they're all gifts people have given me. And now I'm thinking about, you know, I think I didn't take them very seriously because, you know, there's just some pieces people gave me because they know I'm interested in manuscripts and things like that. But because to me, we have to keep this connection to, you know, who created and what does that community look like today? And for us, you know, 1500 is not, when I say us, I mean people who are interested in manuscripts in what we call the Islamicate world, right? So any place from North Africa all the way to, you know, Malaysia. For, you know, manuscript culture is, you know, we would say it's still even alive today, right? So, but definitely 1500 is not a break-off point for us. We go into the 1800s, and so there's a lot for us that, you know, we don't want to pretend as if everything is in the past.
Very good points, all.
Oh gosh, yeah. So
Can I go, Eric?
Go ahead, Tom.
I mean, I'm in utter agreement with all of that, I think. And one of the things I really find fascinating about all this is we've talked a little bit about the idea of the motives behind the fragmentation as an issue. Now I've already lost the thread of my own thinking. But I think that for me, when I think about a cut leaf in particular as a particular subcategory of fragment, and I would want to say very importantly that it's not just manuscripts. There are plenty of printed books, and it's not just medieval material. There are plenty of 19th and 20th century manuscripts that were broken up and leaf by leaf printed into limited editions and so on. The breaking of manuscripts and books is continuing to the present, even in illicit ways. That is, when an author authorizes their publisher to produce a limited edition with their own manuscript piece by piece within it, that's illicit breaking in a sense. But when I'm buying, and I buy mostly on at auction, to me the issue is my concern for the future of these items, so that I don't want to support, and I do my best not to buy from people who are actively breaking books right now. But if I see a leaf that is not, that has gone through someone's estate, for example, my concern is less how long did it spend in that collector's possession than it is how can we secure this for the future. So for me, the licit illicit distinction is not one of time, but one of my concern for the future of the item, if that makes any kind of sense.
Can I jump in, Eric?
Yes.
Can you hear me all right? So I think Sumayya brought
Lisa, I'm sorry to interrupt. I see that you're speaking. You're not muted, but I'm barely hearing you. Nope.
Not coming through.
How about now? Is
There you
that
go.
better?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. Okay. So I just wanted to follow up on something that Sumayya brought up that I think is really important in a broader sense, in thinking about the difference between the trade in Western European manuscripts and manuscript fragments and leaves, as opposed to books that come from Africa, specifically Ethiopia, or from Syria, or from war-torn regions or colonialized regions, where when they make their way to the United States, there's this extra layer of exoticism that's pasted on top of them, that and a lack of knowledge about what they are and how to read them. That also has to be dug into, because in any library you go to, you're going to find boxes of manuscript leaves, and a lot of them are written in Arabic, or they're written in Persian, or they're Ethiopic, or they're Syrian, and very rarely is there someone in the library who can properly catalog them, just because there is a paucity of librarians who are familiar enough with the languages and the literature to tackle that backlog. And that, I think, is something that's also really important to keep in mind, that as Sumayya points out, every one of these books, every one of these leaves has an origin and a person and a community that it belongs to. And as that gets erased due to the lack of knowledge, that's an additional affront, I think, to the community of origin.
Anyone else want to jump in here?
Yeah, I mean, here's the question. I mean, the question that you originally asked was basically, at what point has the radioactive half-life passed that the item is no longer hot? You know, the Hornby Cockerell Bible, for example. I mean, Bruce Farini bought it, sliced it apart on his dining room kitchen table, and then sold the leaves. Stunning leaves. I've got one that I got off of eBay by a guy that didn't know what he had. So if I had bought it from Farini, I mean, I'd be lucky if I could get the blood off of the page, as it were. You know, I mean, talk about a page that's hot. He's the murderer. But the poor schmo that sold it on eBay and didn't know what it was. So all of a sudden, did I buy something that got recently dismembered? Yes. But in this case now, it was a salvage operation, you know? And so what do I do? Do I not buy it and let this page just, you know, no child should be torn from his parents, but you can't leave a crying orphan sitting in the ashes, you know? I recently bought 8 pages from a book of hours with a poem in French. And the first page was missing. And I've come to conclude that the first page had been missing for decades based on the way the pagination was. But I don't need 8 pages, but I didn't want to break up the poem. So I feel like I've come across a poached elephant. And I may not be rescuing the ivory, but I'm saving the ear bones, which are actually more telling about the elephant than any other part. I know that's a really weird analogy, and I hope you forgive me for that. But someone's got to pick up the pieces also. you know? So there's a thought there. I'm done.
So a lot of these comments are bringing up this notion of fragmentology, whether it's of modern manuscripts or deep historical manuscripts, but fragmentology as a community enterprise. None of us who work in the field of fragmentology in any period work alone. We all build upon each other's efforts. We all constantly contact each other with hot finds. If we found a piece of a manuscript, like, you know, Lisa's clued me into stuff that she knows I'm working on. I've let Jim know about things that I know he has. You know, Tom is a dealer. He brings my attention to things that he thinks might be worth preserving. We all work together. So Sumayya, I'm very interested in learning a little bit more about what this community enterprise might mean in terms of preserving things when the community is still here, and what kind of work is actively being done, not just on your part, but the communities with which you work and the communities that you study. Because as a Western medievalist, none of the communities that were potentially impacted by the destruction of their texts really exist anymore. Modern Catholicism, for instance, is nowhere at all remotely close in some ways to medieval Catholicism. So there are those layers of remove too. So I'd love to hear more about that process and your world of fragments.
Well, thank you so much, Eric. So a lot of what I'm hoping to bring to this discussion is things that were told to me by people who, you know, I think I would probably sometimes call them private collectors. So I'm starting maybe lately to maybe use the term citizen archivists, in the sense that these are people who are probably similar to some of the people on my panel who have invested a lot of money and research into developing collections of their own of manuscripts in Arabic or Amazigh, Berber languages, or even Judeo-Arabic in North Africa. So these are people who are, you know, some of them intellectuals, scholars, who themselves have taken upon themselves they would use terms like, you know, saving the they would consider what they consider to be part of a national corpus of manuscripts, what they see as being something that's being lost because of a lot of tension. So they're aware of this, you know, the market pressure to sell. And they're aware of some of the issues that have come up already. So they're aware of people who have collections who don't know what the collections are about, right? Because there is a break still. People who understand, for instance, who are able to understand very old Arabic, old scripts, and people who are to understand the context of where things were written. So they're very much aware, and I think several people that I interviewed could easily be panelists on this panel, you know, if they spoke English, right? So and discussing, and I've seen people who they're actively going out and they're they hear about someone who's passed away, and just to give the context, in Morocco, it's still very common for a family to have some amount of manuscripts that could be hundreds of years old, that they've just been passed down by generations. And right, you might have people who don't understand what they have. But then you do have people who do understand what they have and who are trying to preserve them. And I've seen people really making efforts, and that's why I want to call them almost citizen archivists, because they're really making efforts to preserve their collections in various ways. They're doing research about how to protect from humidity. They're storing them in certain ways. They are lending them out to historians, local historians in their area. They're asking people to print books based on the text. So there is this very vibrant culture, at least in Morocco, I study, of people who are very conscious of loss. And when you talk about loss, and to them, when they say loss, they're talking about, for them, something that starts, right, like say with colonialism. And people brought up to me, when, the Spanish took the collection of the Moroccan Sultan, the collection of Arabic manuscripts that's at Escorial in Madrid is mostly something that was taken from the Moroccan Sultan in the 1600s. This is something that people I'm speaking with today mention as this is part of this loss that we're trying to, to work against. And I've had people say to me, there has to be some way to keep things in the country, or at least keep them for, so there's still people who are interested in our culture. We don't want them just to be decoration. We don't want them just to be, put on display in a museum. That there's still this actually of use, that there's something to be learned from them. So when people there talk about fragmentation, they're talking about fragmentation of also intellectual heritage. People feeling like, no, there's actually something to be learned from these texts still. This is not And so, like I said, this is all things that come out of me talking with them and really seeing the concerns that they have about, what happens to our cultural memory, what happens to our collective memory if all of our texts are museumified or in a library somewhere we have no access to, or even worse, as happens is pretty common, manuscripts being smuggled out of North Africa. And I say smuggled out because it's not legal. I mean, technically it's illegal to take them out of the country, right? But being smuggled out of North Africa, placed into libraries and other collections with the provenance completely taken off. And I've seen examples of myself where it says country of origin and it'll give some kind of very generic thing like Africa, right? Whereas people who know, and luckily, so my vantage point from studying manuscripts has been with scholars. Like I'm very lucky that, people who they themselves have been decades studying manuscripts and they tell me how to look and read a page. So people who know look at it and say, Africa, can't you get a little bit more exact than that? So this kind of fragmentation for them is like, why are these manuscripts leaving the community and we're being cut off from them, right? And I think that's one of the major questions we need to ask ourselves is who still has access to them, right? And is it real stewardship when only, the people who have access to one academic library have access to them, right? And if the community from which the fragments came from have absolutely no way of gaining access to that anymore. And this is an issue both in the country and outside of the country. So I'm not just looking to the West, but even within Morocco, this is an issue of why some people who have very large, substantial collections refuse to give them over to institutions in their own country because they say, and then what? I have the access is cut off for us, right? So these are some of the issues that are there.
Well, that last comment you made about people being unwilling or suspicious about, say, dropping things in institutions, that hits on basic kind of thought that Otto Egge himself advocated for, spreading things out. Christopher de Hamel in his 1995 Rare Book School talk, Cutting Up Manuscripts for Pleasure and Profit, he does this devil's advocacy thing where he talks about splitting manuscripts up as a means of conservation, things like that. And thinking about these things, when you put something in an institution, I think, and I'm speaking as a curator, one of my main selling points is, hey, we're going to keep your stuff in perpetuity. There's no guarantee of that. And as we've seen in some of the very recent manuscript destruction episodes that have happened in the Near East, in Iraq, in North Africa, the only reason certain things survive is because they are not in the care of curated institutions. They're in the care of private people. And that makes the idea of fragmentation, private collecting, and the trade very, very interesting and more fraught and complex to think about. I love your term citizen archivists because responsible collectors, and I include Jim here, he really does, I'll second what Lisa says, he makes his stuff available. It does not enter a basement never to be seen again. It's freely available. And Rose can speak to this too as a student who has directly benefited from taking part in his manuscripts at a workshop. So citizen archivists, I think all of us in our different roles can live that kind of terminology. What other perspectives do you guys have on this?
Well, I think discoverability is becoming so important and is improved so much by digital imagery and the fact that I think people, at least in North America, are really starting to realize the importance of fragments. They used to be kind of the ugly stepchildren. It's a box that says miscellaneous fragments. We're never going to get around to cataloging it. We're not going to image it. We're not going to even create records for it. Not even a hand list. It's just a miscellaneous box. And Eric and I know Eric feels the same way. That's the one you want to get your hands on, right? Anything that says miscellaneous fragments, I want to know what's in that box. But I think because fragmentology, I mean, look how many people are here today, right? I mean, the idea of fragments, fragmentology, and the book, and these questions about the leaf trade, the book trade are so at the fore right now that it's making it more urgent for libraries to feel this pressure to digitize their fragments, even without a lot of metadata. So, for the kind of leaves that Sumayya is talking about, from the kind of books that often don't have someone in the library who can catalog them. If you digitize that and you put it online and you make it just add something to make it discoverable, someone will find it, and some citizen archivist will know what it is and will be able to read it and will be able to tell the library what it is. And that's what we really want to see happening, right? The more things get digitized, the more things are put online, the more we're going to start making these connections, and the more information, the more of that missing, that missing 95%, a lot of that missing material is in these fragments. And the more we get them digitized and the more we have them available for the public to see and for scholars to find, the more we're going to be able to tackle some of these problems but not just discoverability and cataloging, but pedagogy and recovery of missing and fragmented texts.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
I was going to say that some of the leaves I've acquired have actually been deaccessioned from museums. So if you're relying on a museum per se to be a cultural repository, it better be pretty.
Yeah, I will say what might be the next target of my own reconstruction efforts is a fantastic early 13th century English Bible that was broken apart in 1980, and a big chunk of it has been preserved by the fabulous collector Martin Scoyen. He's got 209 leaves of it, but about 143 leaves of it are, not all of them are out in the wild. We have 11 of them at Ohio State, and that's what led me to this manuscript. But that was in the General Theological Seminary in New York until 1980 when they deaccessioned it. It was purchased by Farini, and then very quickly thereafter cut apart. So yeah, you're entirely right, Jim. There is no guarantee that institutions are going to hold on to things. And I thankfully only know of a couple examples of this, and they're not involving medieval manuscripts, but COVID-19 is putting the future of some collections in doubt as institutions face real shortfalls in their budgets. Some of them are thinking about or actively beginning the process of cutting things loose from their collections. And that's something to really think about. Even, something in quote, the secure West, is not really all that secure.
Oh my gosh, there are so many collections where manuscripts have moved around since De Ricci, right? So since 1935, there are hundreds of manuscripts that have been deaccessioned, that have moved, that have been bought and sold. Just because something is somewhere now absolutely doesn't mean it's going to be there 100 years from now. No question about it. These things are mobile. Can I go back though for, Eric, you brought up this question of licit versus illicit, and I think Sumayya made a really clear point that depends on the context, where you're going to draw that line. Some fragments will never be licit, no matter how long ago they were cut up. And some you can convince yourself that if Otto Egge cut it up, well, that deed is done, might as well give it a good home, right? My own feeling is that I would buy an Egge fragment. I wouldn't buy something that Farini had cut up, that was cut up that recently. I don't have an absolute cutoff date, but I would always ask the dealer to tell me when this manuscript was cut up. And if they don't know, I wouldn't buy it. That's always the first step for me. I mean, if it's a manuscript that I know is an Egge manuscript, then I know when it was cut up, thanks to Scott Guara's book. But if it's a manuscript that the dealer can't tell me when this was last a whole book, then I wouldn't buy it. That's my own policy for my own collection. I don't know, Eric. What is your policy as a curator?
So we're faced with a different set of conditions here at Ohio State. When I started working here, we had roughly 670 manuscript fragments in our collection that came from approximately 79 or 80 original codices. And all of these were donated not to the libraries, but to a nascent university art museum that never really got off the ground. ultimately, the Wexner Center for the Arts was founded here at OSU through a big donation by Les Wexner, but that was for modern art. So all of the medieval manuscript leaves that had been given to the university up till that point, we're talking about roughly 1988, all of those went into storage for the better part of a decade or 12 years before coming to the university. Now, the issue at play with OSU's manuscript fragment collection is that virtually the entirety of those fragments were donated as the product of Farini's breaking and his partnership with a handful of different private collectors who went in with him on manuscripts for the purpose of breaking them to donate for tax benefits. So when I started getting to grips with the collection here, it was a very kind of distasteful legacy in a way. I mean, these things were deliberately, in Jim's parlance, they were hunted and then butchered and then distributed. And so for me, I'm the curator of the largest collection of medieval manuscripts, definitely in the state of Ohio, but one of the largest in between the coasts when you get right down to it.
Confirm that. There's no question about that, Eric. Yes.
And I think, you know, with that hat on, I often feel that it's incumbent upon me in the position that I'm in to try to leverage that position to reconstruct as many manuscripts as possible and undo the damage that, say, Farini has done. And he was located here in Ohio. Otto Egge was in Ohio. A lot of Egge's little stores at public libraries to raise money for those public libraries as well as for his own pocketbook were in Ohio. So Ohio is one of the major homes of book breaking. So for me, I feel kind of like I'm in this position where I should be trying to recover some of this lost heritage and reconstruct it. That doesn't mean, however, that I'm out on eBay searching for the book that was shopped last week and then cut apart 3 days ago. I will not buy things like that. For the collections, it's not responsible. But when it comes to well-known products of book breaking, such as Farini, the Folio Files Project, Otto Egge, really known fragment sets, I will try to reconstruct those pretty actively. But I want to kick this over to Rose in a second, because another thing that I have done here, Ohio State does not have big budgets. So a lot of our support of our very active medieval and Renaissance studies program, and then within that, we have an incredibly active manuscript studies and book history component. Lots of faculty and students here are interested in that. I feel that it's incumbent upon me to try to find resources for our students that are going to provide meaningful opportunities for original scholarship and research, reconstruction efforts, things like that. And I do hunt for responsibly sourced, so to speak, manuscript fragments, things like you say, Lisa, that you can determine were products of at least breaking that you can trace back a while and you can get a sense of that provenance. But Rose is someone who's directly experienced kind of the product of that, and purchasing anything, whether you're a private or an institutional collector, is fraught when it comes to fragments. But one of the long-standing justifications going back to Ruskin, if not before, in the 19th century, is that manuscript fragments offer a more egalitarian entry point for all sorts of people into the world of medieval manuscripts and learning about them, emulating the crafts techniques that were employed in them. Rose, you've lived this. What is your perspective on that? And now that you're moving in slowly into the trade, how does that kind of nuance what you think about your own experience as a student?
Well, I think that the first thing I would say would be, we talk a lot about responsible purchasing and responsible collecting and reconstructing. I also think that a very important issue within the topic of fragmentology is responsible use, and using manuscripts in a way that, not to say justify their fragmentation, because I don't think that that is an accurate representation of my sentiment, but using manuscripts in a way that benefits people who wouldn't necessarily be able to use manuscripts otherwise. I'm not going to say that I think we should be putting the Book of Kells into the hands of students every day, because we can all agree that that would be somewhat ridiculous, but I'm someone who has benefited specifically from Eric and many of the professors at Ohio State's efforts to make manuscript material accessible to students. And I think it's incredibly empowering for undergraduate students or the public to be able to hold an original manuscript in their hands. It gives them a connection to history that they may not be able to have otherwise. And I think that the question of kind of egalitarianism when it comes to fragmentation that has been mentioned before just in this discussion, people like Otto Egge, who claim that they fragment manuscripts because it benefits students and it's easier to collect. I think that that is a reality of the effects of fragmenting manuscripts. I will not say that I think that is really what Otto Egge believed and what he really wanted, but I do think that it is a reality of what happens when you fragment manuscripts and make them more available to people. But the way that we have to go about thinking about usage in the classroom is very important, because there are institutions that collect manuscripts but do not make them accessible to their students. There are institutions that do not collect fragments on principle, which, as Eric and I have discussed in the past, is a position of privilege. A place like Ohio State doesn't necessarily have the resources to not collect fragments. But what Eric has done and what I am kind of striving to do in my own work is encouraging people who don't usually have access to fragments to use them, because I won't say that it, again, I won't say it justifies the fragmentation, but it does create a positive impact of their existence. In terms of my own transition somewhat into the trade, I think that the institution that I have been working for approaches fragments in a way that I have found to be extremely respectful. There is an understanding of the gravity of what it means to sell and buy fragments, and a recognition of what that process looks like, and all of those things. But I think there are many firms and institutions that do not take that into consideration. And as we've said, that's something to think about when you're collecting, and just something to consider in your own processes.
Rose, that's such an important point about it, choosing as an institution to not acquire fragments and leaves is really a privilege, because it means you can afford whole codices. And the vast majority of collections in the United States can't afford to do that. They only have, if they have any codices at all, they might have one, maybe two. But almost half of the collections in the United States only have fragments. That's all they have in their collection. And that's because they're so affordable. And if there were no fragments, then those 200 institutions, the students at those institutions wouldn't have the possibility of getting their hands on a piece of 700-year-old parchment. And that's a really thrilling moment that can change your life. I speak from experience, right? I mean, when I got my hands on medieval manuscript fragments, there's no going back. And I always say that with the caveat, I don't want to encourage the breaking of books. Breaking books is a bad thing. It is not a good thing. It is a bad thing, even if it can have a positive outcome. It is still a bad thing to take an object that is unique and precious and centuries old and has an important place in the community from which it came and break it into pieces. That is always going to be bad. But you can find a way to take something that happened that you can't fix and try and turn it into something positive in terms of teaching, pedagogy, and research.
Yeah, I think something.
Go ahead, Rose.
Yeah, just quickly, something I've said many times before is that we see the benefits of having fragments that exist in the world. There is no, in my own opinion, no reason to create more fragments, because any institution or person who would like to buy a fragment, there is a fragment out there that they can buy.
Yeah, there are hundreds of thousands of them already out there. We don't need more.
Yeah,
That's right.
I was going to say something similar, Rose. Thank you for saying that. But the thing that I would extend to that is it's always a question of money and resources. And right now, the shift is not so much do you have the money or the resources to buy manuscripts, it's do you have the money or resources to make those things available digitally. I could kind of get behind in some ways the idea Eggy or Ruskin was going for with, oh, cut apart a manuscript and you make it more widely available to the world. But now at this stage, the preponderance of manuscripts that are out there in the digital realm in terms of being able to have access to the art and the text and the paleography and things like that, you're always at one remove, at least digitally. But there are so many digital objects out there, it really undermines that old historic kind of justification about breaking manuscripts in order to help with education. The big issue now, though, is the resources that are needed by institutions to digitize and mount things, but then also the resources that may or may not be available at other institutions that may not have these things to get access to that material. That's why projects like Digital Scriptorium are extremely important, where that is freely accessible to anyone who wants to look for manuscripts, but not everything is. We are just about at time for, it's 6:10, so we are at time for chat to begin. So I'd like to welcome the audience to start submitting questions, comments for the group, and we'll take things as they come. Let me get the chat open here. Okay, so let me get all the way to the front here. So we've got a question here from Jim Kuhn. Under what circumstances have replevin or repatriation been pursued? Has anyone returned fragments after researching or being informed of provenance? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
No,
You go ahead, Jim.
no, I'm done.
Okay. I will take a stab at that. It wasn't a fragment, but it was a charter. I bought a charter at one point and found out it was on the Index of Lost Art. And I sent it back to the archive in Germany, where it had apparently been looted by an American GI during World War II. Yeah, that happens.
Lisa, you've got a good story about this from your own activities.
Oh, well, yeah, that was a complete codex, but yes, I am actually now a consultant for the Department of Homeland Security on repatriation cases. And I've done several provenance investigations for the US government that have resulted in repatriations. The one that Eric's referring to is a manuscript of Mariegula that was at the Boston Public Library that I was able to prove had been looted during World War II from a library in Venice. And so the Boston Public Library voluntarily began repatriation proceedings. But even when the repatriation is voluntary, you still have to do an investigation and there have to be lawyers, and it got, it took years. Even though the BPL would have been happy just to put it in a box and send it back to them, they couldn't do that. So, and in the end, we had this big ceremony, and it was, I felt good about that. It's nice to see a manuscript that where the law determines that it needs to be returned. I mean, the truth is every medieval European manuscript that's in the United States came from somewhere else. And you do sometimes hear people saying they should all be returned. And there is law that governs those kind of questions that has to come into play.
This isn't an answer that speaks to repatriation, but I have any number of examples of moments where I've walked into a private collector's house and this person wants to show me their collection, and I will say, oh, I know that manuscript. And the most recent one was a gentleman who had told me, this was years ago that I first saw this manuscript, and at the time he had said to me, if you can tell me what that is, I'm going to let Ohio State have it someday. And I knew exactly what it was. It's the famous Otto Eggy Terence manuscript. And so I told him exactly what it was, gave him a history of it, all of that stuff. And he just looked at me shocked, and he's like, well, I'm a man of my word. At some stage, this will be yours. I picked it up a month ago. He's officially gifted it now. So
that's an amazing story.
Yeah, where, private collectors have realized that, oh, I'm trying to reconstruct a particular manuscript, or they'll hear a story by a student like Rose about how they're incorporating these things. And this isn't repatriation, but they're gifting to a collection with wider context that creates opportunities that wouldn't otherwise exist for those fragments. So that's related at least. Anyone else want to weigh in on that question real fast? Okay, we had a question from Robin Jensen. I just lost it here. There we go. What are best practices of determining forged fragments? What is it about fragments that attracts forgers, besides the obvious issues of forging a fragment is easier than forging a full codex? What can scholars, collectors, and dealers do to minimize the environment that creates for demand for forged fragments? Anyone want to take a stab at that? I know, Tom, you've dealt in not what I would call forged fragments, but like Neo-Gothic manuscripts that are kind of homages to earlier manuscript practice.
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever had a forged object. I hope I haven't. For my own peace of mind, one of the things I think I try to do to avoid forgery is I don't spend a lot of money on anything. But for a forger for whom financial gain is not the motive, I don't know how one truly protects oneself against that.
Okay.
I'm about to put in the chat a link to an article by Bill Duba and Christophe Fuller on a forged fragment. It's really fantastic. It's in the Fragmentology journal. So I'm about to post the link in there, and I really recommend everyone go and read it because they talk about some of these methods. This particular fragment was forged on a printer, a really fancy printer. So hold on, I'm about to put that in there.
So Lisa, this is something else. I think a lot of us could talk about this, but you just mentioned Bill Duba and Fragmentarium. One of the questions is, what platforms do you find most useful for crowdsourcing digitized fragments for identification? And I know you've used stuff in your Simmons class too.
Yep, putting that in the chat too. Check out fragmentarium.ms. That's where it's happening. It's an amazing platform. It's IIIF. It's all interoperable, linked data, and it allows you to upload images or mirror IIIF images to catalog fragments and to digitally put them back together using shared canvas viewers. It's really important, and it's really easy to learn how to use. Anyone can become a contributor and start uploading images. It's really fantastic. Oh, that's great. Rachel Duke says she's introducing students to Fragmentarium. That's excellent. Spread the word.
Oh, I'm having trouble keeping up with all of the chat things going on here. Laura, I don't know if you have one lined up that you can read. I'm catching up on things.
Sure, we have a question from Sonali, who asks, Sumayya, is digitization of personal collections being encouraged by Moroccan institutions? I do realize that digitization is an expensive process.
So private collections being digitized. So yeah, there are different levels of private collections in Morocco. So you have some private family foundations who have collections, who are trying, maybe in cooperation with some institutions who do have digitization, to digitize their collections. The more private people that I met who own collections are in theory interested in digitization, and they have actually, I know people who, for instance, if there was a scholar or an organization that was very interested in one of their manuscripts, they would, I've seen them give a manuscript to be digitized for, the scholar wanted to work with it or wanted to somehow showcase it. So I've seen people be willing to do that. The issue for digitization is that digitization is not a fail-safe. Digitization, I would say, is a temporary measure because, as we all know, we can no longer use floppy disks too readily, right? So digitization, it is making an image, a surrogate for the materials that in poorer countries, we have issue of access to the internet, access to computers, access to broadband. And then in a few years, even if we were to give, for instance, the families a copy of the digitized materials, which is what some of these international organizations do who go in and digitize, they don't have the ability to migrate those materials. So it's fine, and burn you in whatever way you want to give them a copy of the digitized manuscripts. If you're the British Library, you can migrate that, and you can still have access to that, maybe in 20 years. But a family who barely has internet access or is not going to be able to do much with that material as the whatever media it's on gets older. So I think digitization is good, but I think it has to be somehow tempered with some kind of idea of other ways. In archives, we have this idea of locks, lots of copies, keep things safe, so in lots of different formats. And I feel that from the people that I spoke with, they were very much interested also in preservation and conservation of their materials, as well as digitization. So they wanted to have copies in different formats. I haven't had an owner say to me, I really just wanted a published company to print it as a book, right? He said he's like, they don't have to even type it, just, take the manuscript and make a digital copy and print it. He just, this idea, so they're very concerned of different ways to keep the text alive.
I would also point everyone to the work of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library. In this regard, they're doing a lot of conservation work on manuscripts that are in situ but are threatened, where libraries and communities are threatened, usually in war-torn regions. Definitely take a look at the work that they're doing. It's pretty extraordinary and really important.
So we had another question here that maybe Tom, Jim, and Rose could tackle from your different perspectives. It was about whether or not in situ binding fragments, manuscripts as recycled binding fragments, increases the value of the book you're looking at. And I'm thinking Jim as a private collector, Tom as a dealer, and Rose has currently embarked on yet another manuscript project where she's surveying our bindings for stowaways.
Kind of. It depends on what the fragment is. I mean, if it's a 15th century Spanish antiphonal, sorry, now if it's a 9th century Anglo-Saxon Psalter, holy McMoly, yeah, the fragment's worth more than the whole darn book. But, it's like a diamond, carat, color, quality. There's a lot of factors that go into it.
But from my perspective as a dealer, I want to say yes. Oftentimes, the fragment is worth more than the printed book, and surprising things are still out there. I was delighted to find a Beneventon fragment in situ in a printed book, for example.
Yeah, that's something I gotta find.
I also think some of the value from the academic standpoint of in situ binding fragments is that they, in many ways, show us how people in the past thought about books and what books meant to them. And in many ways, binding fragments are being treated essentially as garbage, but there is still value in seeing kind of the ways in which they're incorporated, and even just how binding structure worked, say in the early modern era, uses of parchment in binding structure. So I think there's a lot of very interesting academic material to be gained from studying these in situ fragments.
I introduced my students today to one of the best things I've ever found on eBay, which was a late 16th century folio printed breviary from Venice. And it's on paper, but the mice really got to the page edges. And the monastery that owned this wound up cutting apart at least 6 different manuscripts and incorporating more than 30 different fragments from this manuscript to repair the page edges. So this isn't a binding fragment, it's a patch job. But the texts that they preserve go back to the at least the 11th century. They represent theological works, confessional theological works, a letters collection, a Marian treatise by a 2nd century Greek father, as well as historical charter documents going back into the 1290s. And what this kind of thing can show, and I'm going to be writing up an article on this, is possibly reconstructing what was in that monastic library. Because these monks who own this book, the house was probably using manuscripts that it had at its own disposal, but that they no longer needed to repair this volume. So you never know what you're going to find in these, and it's not just about the texts you can recover, it's about the library context that you might be able to recover.
Yeah, and then I just threw this into the chat that, you know, I'm a big believer in preaching the gospel of binding surveys, especially in the US. There are so many early fragments to be found in 16th century, 15th and 16th century bindings in particular. You can find, you know, 10th century, 9th century, and there's relatively little in the number of codices. Caroline and certainly pre-Caroline codices in North America. You can probably count them on, you know, your fingers and toes. But in terms of binding fragments, there are so many discoveries still to be made. I can't wait to hear what Rose finds as she surveys the OSU bindings. There's just so much waiting there to be found, and especially if you can image them, then it's even better, because then there's more access to them.
Yeah, and in situ binding fragments, or binding fragments in general, raise yet another questions about another layer of fragmentation. I'm sure all of us who are in the world of fragments have encountered loose fragments that once were part of bindings, and those bindings were taken apart, whether it was for earlier misguided conservation attempts, whether it's through overuse and the book falls apart. But I know of a handful of collections that deliberately, and not necessarily that far back in time, that have deliberately removed binding fragments from the bindings in which they've traveled for centuries. This creates a whole new family of fragments, because the history of binding is just as important as the history of text, paleography, or codicology. So you got to be careful about those as well. Just because it was a manuscript that was cut up maybe centuries ago or last week and then put into a binding doesn't mean that now its physical carrier doesn't have some sort of intellectual credibility and importance too.
And that's what you find, like at the Bibliothèque Nationale, they have all these volumes of fragments that were removed from bindings in early modern books at the Bibliothèque Nationale that they then put into these collections, these scrapbooks, that are actually now being digitized and cataloged at Fragmentarium. And they're just amazing, incredible early things to be found, but they don't always record what book the manuscript, the fragment was used in the binding of, which is a really important piece of information.
Yeah, that's actually something that Eric and I have been talking about a lot in our study of OSU's binding fragments, is that we have to, you know, we're in this age of increasing digitization, and if we're all going to study binding fragments, we should really establish norms for what we're going to record when we find them, so that we can start to understand the connections and what people in the early modern era or later were actually thinking and practicing when they were doing this.
Exactly. Let's see, Maggie Wilson asks, can you imagine any practices for conservation now that scholars say in 100 years in the future might consider fragmentation? So we've touched on this a little bit with like the idea of rebinding, but what else is there when we think about current conservation practices or even digitization practices that could result in fragmentation?
I think we still don't know how this idea of the digital object will play out going forward. You know, I mean, if you were attending the Dark Archives conference last week, there was a lot of conversation about the digital object as its own thing, with a separate life and a separate life cycle, which is sort of like what Sumayya was saying, that it's not always permanent. And it may be that we'll see the fact that digital repositories will not be permanent, that will lead to redistribution of images, or that somehow we'll see digital fragmentation. It will be, I'm not sure how that will play out. I think we're still waiting to see how that goes as we move forward.
Can I just say very quickly, as someone who's witnessed digitization, I mean, some of the things I've seen, they're kind of breaking those books as they're trying to digitize them to sometimes. I've seen some uncomfortable positions books are being put, codices are being put in order to digitize them. So I think, you know, we have to be honest that sometimes we are actually making the codices more vulnerable in the digitization process sometimes. Yeah.
Loving them to death.
Well, we're about at time. We've got maybe opportunity for last couple comments from any of the panelists. If not, I would just like to thank them all for their participation and their insight and their generosity in giving their time to us. I'd like to thank all of the attendees for coming and for being so patient and listening to us ramble on about fragments, for offering up your own perspectives and your own questions in the chat. And again, a profound thanks to the RBS people for making all of this happen. I've really enjoyed this. I've learned a lot, and my hand is actually a little bit cramped right now from notes I've been taking about things I want to follow up on myself. So thank you very
so
much.
much, Eric. Thank you for putting it together. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all, to all of our panelists, to Eric for moderating, for everybody for joining us this evening. I did want to let you all know that this recording will be available on our YouTube channel for Rare Book School within a week or two. And I did want to take an opportunity to quickly put in a small plug that Rare Book School's programs, including the RBS Online programs like this one, are made possible by the generosity of our alumni and by our friends like you. If you're able, please consider supporting these programs with a gift of any size, really any size, because through the 30th of September, all gifts will be matched dollar for dollar, which will double the impact that you're making on these programs and on the students and the community that we bring together at Rare Book School. You can find the link for making that gift in the chat, and it's also available on our website. So thank you all, and we hope to see you at a Rare Book School event again soon.